Great. Welcome, Bob.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for coming, everybody. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Bob.
Okay. So again, this is the third part in a series on sanitation. I'm Bob Tracy. I own a small wine laboratory and do sanitation consulting as part of my business. And I've been in the wine industry for about 25 years now and have been working on wine laboratory testing and also conducting sanitation audits at wineries. And so I have a lot of experience with sanitation. How
So
to,
just one thing I want to interrupt and say, if anybody has questions, they can either put them in the chat or they can just speak up and ask a question.
yes, that would be great. Um, so the first part, I talked generally about wine microbiology, and I did that because it's so important to winery sanitation. In the second part, I talked about, I gave you kind of an overview of winery sanitation, including like definitions, the major factors influencing cleaners and sanitizers, the types of cleaners and sanitizers used in the wine industry, um, also how to monitor the effectiveness of sanitation. And then what I saw is what I usually see as common risks in wineries as far as sanitation. And then I provided you some real world examples of a correlation between ineffective sanitation practices and poor wine quality. So today's seminar is going to be about the benefits, the recommendations, and improvements that I see regarding sanitation. So first, I'll talk about what are the benefits of having an effective sanitation program. And then I'll go into what are the recommended sanitation practices for cellar equipment and bottling equipment, recommendations for infrastructure services, recommendations for water. So those will be, I'll provide pretty detailed recommendations for sanitation practices. And then the final topic will be showing you real world examples of the impact of improved sanitation practice on reducing microbial loads at several different wineries. So I've gone in, done a sanitation audit, they've improved their sanitation practices, and then when I go back, you can see a dramatic reduction in microbial loads because they've introduced effective sanitation practices. So that'll be the final topic. So let's first talk about the benefits of an effective sanitation program. So improved wine quality, of course, is one. You can effectively manage and prevent microbial loads. You have reduced risk of product contamination by wine spoilage microbes. So your wine quality automatically will improve dramatically if you have effective sanitation practices, because sanitation is getting rid of these wine spoilage microbes. You'll have increased productivity and operating efficiency due to reduced rework. So you won't have to go back and filter wines. You won't have to do any other rework on wines to get rid of the microorganisms. Greater consistency of products. You won't have a lot of as much variation in your products. This is one of the things that I see quite a bit is if there's a lot of contamination in wines, you can have inconsistent products. Some will be fine and some will have spoilage. Reduced environmental impact. If you're doing effective sanitation practices, you don't need to use as much cleaners and sanitizers. And so you're not sending as many cleaners and sanitizers out into the environment. The cost of doing business is reduced, but revenue is increased. Production costs are going to go down. You won't have to do as much wine remediation, taking out VA, 4EP, 4EG, TCA, TBA. So your production costs will actually decrease if you do effective sanitation because you won't having to do a bunch of rework to get wines back to where you want them. You won't have to deal with product downgrades, scrapped product, or recalled product. So the recalled product comes in with finished products. And I see this quite a bit where you have secondary fermentation in bottled product, and so they have to recall the product. And when this happens, this is very costly. So you won't have to recall product. if you have effective sanitation practices. You'll have fewer customer complaints and increased customer loyalty. So these are all the benefits of having an effective sanitation program. You save money, you have better quality, you won't have to get rid of product, you won't have to downgrade the product. So this is a real world example of a winery who they had widespread Brettanomyces contamination in their cellar wines. They had to do several remediation activities, including 4EP, 4EG removal, a lot of filtration of their wines. So they had several wines which had Brettanomyces contamination. They implemented improved sanitation practices for all aspects of the winemaking process. The quality benefit right away was they had significant initial and maintained decrease in Brettanomyces populations and 4EP, 4EG levels. So as soon as they implemented effective sanitation practices, their Brettanomyces populations quickly went down, if not eliminated in most circumstances, and then they didn't, their 4EP, 4EG levels in their wines went down. And then the cost benefits of the improved sanitation practices were they reduced their wine filtration costs by $70,000 a year, with reduced filtration supplies, reduced labor, and reduced wine loss. And this was a small to medium-sized winery, and $70,000 to them was a lot of money. So by implementing their improved sanitation practices, their Brettanomyces populations went down dramatically, and they didn't have to do 4EP, 4EG removal. And so they saved a lot of money. They saved, in addition to the filtration costs, they also saved money because they didn't have to take out 4EP, 4EG. And they actually reduced the barrel purchase costs because they weren't purchasing as many barrels. So they probably saved, $100,000 to $150,000 annually just by implementing improved sanitation practices where they didn't have to deal with Brettanomyces. So this is a real world example of, yes, if you do improve sanitation practices, you will reduce the cost of your process. Okay, so that was the benefits of an improved sanitation practices. So let's talk about recommended sanitation practices. I'm going to first talk about general recommendations for a successful and sustainable winery sanitation program. Some of these will really only apply to large wineries, but there are several recommendations here which do apply to small wineries, which most of you guys are. So just remember that some of them are for larger wineries, and I'll point that out. So first of all, as we talked about in the last part, you want to employ a 4-step process for equipment and infrastructure. You want to do an initial rinse, clean, rinse, and then sanitize. And you don't need to remove the sanitizer or rinse off the sanitizer after you apply it if you're not going right back into a tank, for instance. The major factors influencing the effectiveness of cleaners and sanitizers, which is what we talked about in the last part: time, temperature, chemical concentration, and mechanical force. These are the factors which will impact the cleaners and sanitizers the most. My recommendation is to clean and sanitize equipment and supplies after use. So instead of letting them sit for days or weeks or months, clean them as soon as you can. Because the organic debris and biofilm start developing on equipment, and they're much harder to get off if you let them sit for a long period of time. And then sanitize equipment and supplies before use. So you've cleaned and sanitized the equipment after using it, and then before you use it again, you want to sanitize it. Wear gloves when performing sanitation activities, and this is more of not just for safety, but also for preventing microbial cross-contamination. And this is what I was getting to a second ago. Do not let wine linger on equipment and infrastructure. The longer it sits, the harder it is to clean, because the organic debris and the biofilm start drying on, and they're very difficult to get off. So it's important that if you can, to try to clean and sanitize equipment and infrastructure after use. A lot of places over the last several years do not incorporate infrastructure into their winery sanitation program. And by infrastructure, I mean walls, floors, drains, air handlers. That has to be part of the sanitation program because wine microbes get aerosolized from floors and drains and walls. And so they get in the atmosphere and then they can land on your equipment and then they can land in your product. Periodically perform a deep cleaning and sanitizing of equipment and infrastructure, either semi-annually or annually. And this means taking apart equipment with the clamps, disconnecting clamps, and putting it and cleaning, really scrubbing the inside of piping and hoses as much as you can. This is really important to remove these biofilms or organic debris that's developed on the interior of equipment. Develop and implement an effective sanitation program. Establish a baseline sanitary state of the facility. So this is what I do a lot of times for wineries. I'll go out and see how sanitary their facility is. And then we can get an idea, okay, is there a lot of issues? Is there some issues? Is there not many issues? But it's just a good idea to know what the sanitary state of your facility is. And you could do this with ATP testing too. If you guys decide to get kind of a ATP system in place, you can actually test various equipment with ATP and see how you're doing from a cleanliness standpoint. You should have sanitation standard operating procedures. So every time the procedure is done the same way. So you have a written procedure, you're training to that procedure, so everybody does it the same way. Because if you don't have something written down and you're not training to that, the practices can be all over the place. Some person's going to do it this way, some person's going to do it this way, and it's not consistent. The third one here, a master sanitation schedule, is more for a larger winery, which has a lot of equipment, a lot of production areas. And basically this master sanitation schedule tells you when you should do each activity, in each sanitation activity, what day you should do it, whether you do it daily, weekly, monthly, yearly. But that's more for a larger winery. You should have sanitation specifications for equipment and infrastructure, whether it be ATP or microbes. All of the ATP testing units, they all have specifications that you can go by for your equipment and infrastructure. And if you find you can't get that information, you can ask me. You want a sanitation maintenance program. So you routinely monitor the sanitation effectiveness, either visually with ATP or actually swabbing for microbes. You want to be able to routinely see how effective your sanitation is. You have good practices maybe, but maybe you need to monitor how effective they are, because sometimes stuff gets missed. The best way to do this is just have maybe the one area that I find that wineries do this most often is bottling lines, where before they bottle in the mornings, they'll do an ATP testing of their filler spouts, their corker, their sparger, just to make sure that their sanitation practice is effective. You want to have continuous process improvement, like sanitary design. You want to be monitoring your process, as I was mentioning above. You want to have documentation reviews. Is your sanitation practice still up to date? Do you need to modify it to make it better? So you're constantly looking at your process to make sure it's effective and doing its job. You want management commitment for sanitation. This is where a lot of wineries struggle. Is there's always a push to get production going and make sure there's a lot of throughput, which is very important, of course. But sanitation needs to be part of the winery environment, and so you need management commitment. Do not sacrifice sanitation activities for increased production. It always leads to problems. If you're disregarding your sanitation but increasing your production, you will eventually run into an issue. You may not have had one for 5 years, maybe even 10 years, but eventually it will catch up with you. Have one individual responsible for the sanitation program. Again, this is one of the areas that's more for larger wineries, which have a lot of sanitation personnel. But in those situations, for the larger wineries, you definitely need somebody who's in charge of sanitation, because you don't want multiple people in charge of sanitation saying different things. You want one person saying the same thing. Make sure sanitation program is part of the winery budget. You should allocate certain funds each year for sanitation. And that way you know that that money is going to improve your sanitation. Maintain ongoing wine microbiology and sanitation training education, which is what you're doing here. So make sure you review. And then, Julie, I assume that these webinars will be available for people on.
Yes, we've recorded them, and they're all located on the Wine Quality Alliance website. I've sent links to everybody, but if anybody has a question about accessing a link to the previous 2 talks, just let me know, and I'll give that link to you.
Yeah, great. Because that way you can refer to these presentations, and then that would be part of your training. Like annually, you just kind of go through them and see what information you need to update, that sort of thing. Okay, let's talk about cellar equipment, tanks specifically. What are the recommended sanitation practices? So my recommendation, as I said before, is to clean and sanitize tanks after each use. So you want to rinse with warm filtered water. Again, the water, this is the critical piece. The water needs to be clean. Because if it's not clean, if it's not filtered, it's not going through UV light, you're going to have microbes in there. And if you have microbes in your water, those are being sprayed all over your equipment. And they may not be wine spoilage microbes, but the presence of the microbes in the water actually negatively impacts your cleaner, the effectiveness of your cleaners and sanitizers. So this is why you need clean water whenever you're doing sanitation. So rinse with warm filtered water, clean with warm, hot, KOH cleaner, sodium hydroxide, sodium carbonate cleaner, or sodium carbonate cleaner. So one of these types of cleaners is a caustic cleaner, or one of these kind of lower, not quite as strong cleaner like sodium carbonate. You want to use those type of cleaners in the presence of warm, hot water. And then rinse the cleaner off with filtered water, and then sanitize with peracetic acid or chlorine dioxide. I believe the last part, I might have been Meredith. I don't know if she's on this today, but she brought up that it costs a lot for the peracetic acid, and it does. But the one thing I thought about after that last part was you don't need very much peracetic acid. It's a very small volume for actually sanitizing. So the initial cost is high, but then you don't need very much of it each time you sanitize something. So it might be worth looking into to get it as your sanitizer, because I found that peracetic acid or chlorine dioxide are the best sanitizers in the wine industry right now. So if you can get those, that would be really helpful to you. And then you want to make sure all the valves, like the rack bottom sample valves, the door gasket, and the fittings are cleaned and sanitized as well. So not just the interior of the tank, but all of the valves and everything associated with the tank need to be cleaned, including scrubbing and then sanitizing. And then if the tank has been cleaned and sanitized after you've used it, then the next time you're going to want to use it, you can just sanitize it if the hold time is exceeded. So I found that if you sanitize a tank, clean and sanitize a tank, usually you can wait about 3 to 10 days without having to sanitize, without having to sanitize the tank, because usually the sanitizer hold time is usually 3 to 10 days, and that's how long before microbes start coming back. So if you can wait, if you're past 10 days for sure, you need to sanitize again. You need to clean the exterior of the tanks, not just the interior, but every once in a while you need to actually clean the outside of the tanks, because again, they can harbor microbes on the outside of tanks, just like the floors and the walls can. And you could use a caustic foam for this. And it could be quarterly, semi-annually, or annually, depending on how much debris and mold is developing on the outside of the tanks. So that was tanks. What about wine transfer hard lines, pumps, and wine hoses? I always recommend that when possible for pumps and wine hoses, combine cleaning and sanitizing with tank sanitation. So each time you do a tank sanitation, make sure you use a pump and a hoses. That way those get cleaned and sanitized as well. The pumps, all the hard lines, the pumps and the hoses, again, should be cleaned and sanitized after each use. Rinse with warm water, clean with one of these cleaners, rinse with filtered water, and then sanitize with sanitizer like peracetic acid or chlorine dioxide. So again, that's a similar process. You're rinsing, you're cleaning, you're rinsing, and you're sanitizing. Again, sanitize before use if sanitizer hold time is exceeded. And a very important thing, make sure your equipment drains properly after sanitation. You don't want any stagnant water in there. This is especially the case with hard lines and hoses, because if there's any sort of bend in the hose and water is just sitting in there, you'll eventually develop contamination inside there. So make sure everything's drained well.
So Bob, this is kind of unrelated, but so if your washing machine at home, is that an issue for those as well? That if you need to sanitize your dishwasher and your clothes washer?
Yes,
Would it fall under the same category of not having a line that's straight?
that's right. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, so you need to sanitize that as well. So the another piece of this is deep cleaning and sanitizing, as I mentioned earlier. You want to do this maybe twice a year before and immediately after harvest. Where like for the pumps, you're disassembling the pump head and cleaning the interior thoroughly. For hoses and hard lines, there's a pig sponge ball that you can scour out the inside of wine hoses and hard lines in the presence of the cleaner. And then for the wine hoses, you can use that pig by connecting the hoses together and circulating the cleaner and the sanitizer. So it's very important that you do a deep cleaning of the equipment at least twice a year. And it always works out well to do it before harvest and after harvest, because stuff will sit in there for a long period of time. And that's very difficult to clean. Then there's miscellaneous equipment. And by this, I mean like gooth mixers, kegs, stainless steel barrels, barrel fill wands, barrel topping wands, lees stirrers. One of the areas that I find Brettanomyces contamination is in the barrel topping wands, the barrel topping guns, the barrel fill wands. So those need to be cleaned and sanitized after each use. Again, for these, you want to clean and sanitize after each use. For this type of equipment, if you can, try to use a clean out of place container or a large sink, or you can actually put them in the cleaner solution. And then, so you want to rinse with filtered water, clean with one of the cleaners, rinse with filtered water, and then sanitize with peracetic acid or chlorine dioxide. So again, it's really cleaning the inside of them is really the important part. And again, sanitize before use if the sanitizer hold time is exceeded, which typically is 3 to 10 days. And again, like with the hoses and the hard lines and the pumps, you want to make sure that the equipment drains properly, so there's no stagnant water. So small parts and fittings. Again, clean and sanitize the fittings and clean out of place containers. That can be like 3 large buckets or a sink that has 3 containers in it. So container number 1 should have like sodium percarbonate solution, and you want to be scrubbing the fittings in that solution. Have a filtered water rinse container, and then the third container is your sanitizer like peracetic acid. Replace solutions 1 and 2 weekly unless they become dirty. And then for the parasitic acid, you can check the concentration of the PAA, and it should be at least 100 parts per million. And this solution definitely should be replaced at least weekly. So as long as the solutions don't become real dirty or cloudy, you can keep them for a few days at least. And then sanitize fittings before each use. So you clean and sanitize them. You put them on a pegboard to dry, and then when you go to use them again, just dump them in the, dip them in the parasitic acid container to sanitize them. Oak barrels. I assume most of the wineries have oak barrels, right? So, is that right, Julie?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yes.
So this is what I recommend for cleaning and sanitizing oak barrels. Rinse with warm to hot filtered water to remove the debris, and this could be like a couple minutes. Steam clean for at least 5 minutes. If you know that Brettanomyces was in those barrels, you want to steam clean for at least 10 minutes, and 12 minutes is probably even better. You want to apply a vacuum for 2 to 5 minutes. The reason there's a range here is because sometimes when you apply a vacuum, it'll suck in the head, so you want to be careful about that. The vacuum actually draws all the liquid out of the pores of the wood, so it's a very important step in the steaming process after you steam. Rinse with room temperature water to cool down the barrels, and then sanitize if you can with ozone for 2 to 3 minutes. I don't know how many people have access to ozone, but this actually seems to help even more after you steam clean to sanitize the surface of the barrel, interior surface. Allow the interior of oak barrels to air dry if using SO2 gas for empty barrels. So after you steam clean them, you want to let them air dry if you're going to use SO2 gas to store them. Because if you leave them wet, the SO2 gas reacts with water to form sulfuric acid. And when sulfuric acid is formed, it actually creates kind of a varnish smell inside the barrels. So it's very important to let them dry if you're going to use SO2 gas. Okay, so that was cellar equipment. What about the bottling line? Julie, do you know if most of the wineries use a mobile bottle?
I would say a majority of them are using a mobile bottler and probably the same one.
Okay,
But there are a handful that bottle themselves.
okay, all right.
Mhm.
So this still applies for all situations. Um, so this is what I recommend for bottling equipment. Sanitize daily at startup and after extended downtime with either hot water, and again, the hot water has to be at 180 degrees for at least 20 minutes, or use steam. So that's a startup or after extended downtime. At shutdown, usually daily shutdown, you want to use a chemical CIP. So you want to actually clean with a hot, like potassium hydroxide cleaner or sodium bicarbonate cleaner, rinse with water, and then sanitize with parasitic acid or chlorine dioxide. So you're getting hot water, steam in the morning at startup, and then at the end of the day, you're using a chemical CIP because you want to kind of mix things up and not have to use the same thing every single time. Remember, I was saying before that hot water or steam can actually bake on biofilms if they're there. And in that situation, really the only way you can get them off is by doing a chemical CIP. You want to clean the exterior of the equipment at weekly shutdown. So several wineries are now using a caustic foam cleaner where they'll spray the foam onto the outside of the equipment and let it sit on there and then do some scrubbing and then rinse it off. Because remember, the exterior of equipment, while not as risky for microbial contamination, it's still a risk because you have microbes sitting on there. And if they're not taken off, they can get aerosolized and get into your product. The sparger spouts, the rinser, the filler spouts, the porker system, and the screw capper system at daily startup and shutdown, they should be sprayed with 70% alcohol and wiped down. So this is both daily startup and shutdown. And then also if there's downtime on the bottling line, you want to spray with 70% alcohol about every 30 minutes. Because you'd be surprised how many microbes are in the atmosphere and they land on the filler spouts and the sparger spouts during downtime. You want to ensure the integrity of your filters at least once a day. So some of the large wineries actually ensure the integrity of the filters twice a day. So once every 12 hours, those facilities are running 24 hours a day. So they actually check twice the integrity of the filters. But you want to make sure before you do your run that you can check the integrity. And this is usually by a bubble point test or a pressure hold test. The bubble point test, there's a protocol from Scott Laboratories that you can get for this. And it works quite well for the smaller wineries.
Is that, Bob, this is Bob Pruitt. Is
Hi.
that integrity test to see if there have been failures like in the mesh or the filter?
Yes.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. Yeah, it'll tell you whether there's any failure in the actual membrane filter. Yeah.
Thank you.
Again, as with the cellar equipment, you want to periodically do a deep cleaning and sanitizing of bottling line equipment. And this means taking apart, disassembling as much as you can of the blinds and valves and really doing a deep cleaning, which means scrubbing them in the presence of a cleaner. So now I'm going to talk about what are the potential sources of microbial contamination during the bottling process. So these are all of the areas that I've seen contamination on a bottling line. And these contamination points have all led to secondary fermentation in bottled product. So the equipment and transfer lines, hoses from bottling tanks to the bottling facility, you would think, well, that's before the filtration process. But what if your filtration process fails? Or what if you have such a high load of microbes in your wine that it actually gets past the filtration process? So you want to make sure that the equipment and transfer lines and hoses from your bottling tanks to the bottling facility or bottling truck are actually cleaned and sanitized properly. Because I've found a lot of contamination in those, and that I know that has directly led to contamination in the product. Because they either weren't filtering their product or they had such a high load of microbes in the wine that it overwhelmed the filtration system. The wine filtration system, again, is another area that I found contamination. And in this case, they had ineffective integrity testing. They have dead legs in their system, so pipes or valves that are allowing solution just to sit in there and it can't get cleaned and sanitized effectively. Threaded fittings and piping. The equipment and transfer lines, hoses from the filtration system to the filler. So this would be the hard line or hose from the filtration system to the filler bowl. Again, I mentioned this before, but this is an area where you really need to make sure that is cleaned and sanitized properly. Because I have found that, because I swab every time I do a bottling line audit, I swab this line. And a lot of times I'll find contamination in that line. And that's after the filter. So you're actually just continually contaminating your product as it's going through this line. So this is a very important point of making sure it's clean and sanitized. Bottling line equipment, such as the sparger or rinser system. So I found contamination on the sparger spouts. There's usually a drain associated with the sparger system. I found tons of contamination in that. And again, microbes get aerosolized from that drain. The filler system. So the filler system, I found contamination on filler spouts. I found it in the filler vacuum system. I found it in the compressed air that goes to the filler. I found it in the nitrogen that goes to the filler. So there's a lot of areas on a bottling line in the filler system where you can potentially have a source of contamination. The corker system. So again, I found contamination on the corker system, which led to secondary fermentation in product. And it can be the actual corker jaws. It can be the corker vacuum system. So in 3 different instances, I found that the corker vacuum system was responsible for the contamination on the bottling line. And also it could be the corker cups. It could be where the corker cups sit up inside the system. It could be the cork hopper. The screw capper system, I've also found contamination. And this can include the railing for the capsules, the railing tip where the capsule comes off and onto the bottle. So on 4 different occasions, I found that railing tip where the capsule comes off and goes onto the bottle, that actually was heavily contaminated with yeast and bacteria, wine spoilage yeast and bacteria. And that was where the contamination source was for the product they were having secondary fermentation. So there's a lot of areas on the bottling line where it's you need to make sure it's cleaned and sanitized properly. The facility infrastructure, the drains and floors. A lot of wineries will have their bottling lines like a drain like right next to their filler system, which makes sense because there's you need a drain there. But that drain, I found in several instances was responsible for contamination of their product. So the microbes are becoming aerosolized from the drain, drifting up into the filler, and then contaminating the product. The atmosphere and ventilation system. So if the atmosphere in your facility, the bottling area is not real clean, you can get contamination on the filler spouts, on the sparger spouts, on your corker system, on your screw capper system. Bottling facility water. The water has to be clean, as I was saying. You don't want any microbes in the water. I found this to be a source of contamination in a couple of occasions for a bottling line because their water was not clean and the water was just being sprayed onto their equipment. Compressed air and processed gas lines, so like nitrogen gas lines. You need to make sure these are cleaned and sanitized. I found tons of contamination in compressed air lines and in nitrogen lines. And you wouldn't think that you'd find anything in nitrogen line because that's anaerobic, but you still get microbes developing inside these lines. Okay, that was the bottling. So let's talk about infrastructure. So drains, walls, floors, ceiling, even the ceiling, support structures, sumps. All of these are considered part of your infrastructure. In my experience, floors, drains, drain troughs, and sumps are the dirtiest areas in the winery. Every time I do an audit, these are the areas that are the most contaminated, which makes sense because they don't get cleaned very, very much. You want to regularly inspect for microbial growth, looking for visible mold and slime. I recommend like monthly, just walking around your winery and making sure that you don't see any microbial growth on your floors, in your drains, on your outside of your equipment. Daily sanitation for infrastructure. You want to sweep the floors and clean out debris from the drains. You want to clean up wine stains and organic debris and slime daily, and squeegee any liquids remaining on the floor. So once you've done your cleaning, you want to get rid of the liquids because they're a point where microbes will start growing. Monthly sanitation. So you want to clean your walls, floors, and drains. One way is to use a caustic foam cleaner, and this includes scrubbing surfaces. But if you do it monthly, you won't need to do a ton of scrubbing. You want to rinse off the caustic foam cleaner with, again, filtered water, and then squeegee any liquids remaining on the floor and let dry. And then after you do your cleaning, you can spray on a quaternary ammonium compound, which is a sanitizer, and you let the surfaces dry. Quaternary ammonium compound kind of forms an invisible layer on the surface, which continually acts to kill microbes. So you cleaned your surfaces, you rinse them, and then you apply a quaternary ammonium compound sanitizer. And quats work very well on infrastructure surfaces. So again, quarterly, you want to be able to you want to remove debris and spider webs from the ceiling. The ceiling is not going to be as contaminated or get from as much material, but again, it will develop spider webs and debris over time. And then clean with your caustic foam cleaner, rinse off the cleaner with filtered water, squeegee any liquids remaining on the floor and let dry, and then spray the clot onto the surfaces. So sometimes if you're not developing a lot of contamination on your infrastructure surfaces, you can back off the clot and do it just quarterly instead of monthly. But I always have wineries start monthly using the clot, and then slowly as things improve, they can back it off to using it quarterly. If possible, attempt to maintain cellar temperatures between 55 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit and a relative humidity of less than or equal to 70%. Unfortunately, as you get above 70%, molds start growing on your surfaces. So this temperature and humidity seems to strike a pretty good balance between not letting any mold grow on the surfaces and still not evaporate too much of your wine, of the alcohol in the wine. And then I would recommend installing air purification systems to help reduce microbial populations in the atmosphere, especially if you have a lot of issues with microbes in your air. And this can include HEPA filters. There's units called aeroside units, which actually the air goes in, there's a UV light inside them, and it kills any of the microbes. It actually breaks down like TCA and TBA. So these are very effective. They're expensive though. The other thing that some wineries use is ozone gas in their production areas. At night, they'll leave ozone gas on for a couple of hours, and then by the morning, it's dissipated. But
sorry to interrupt. Do
yeah.
you recommend the HEPA filter in areas with fire and smoke?
Yes, because HEPA filters take out a lot of that stuff. Yes. Yeah.
I think that there's some other guidance for filtration in that kind of environment. Maybe that's where Julie was leading, or the HEPA may be a good final filter, but some of the upstream filtration maybe there may be things more appropriate. Otherwise, you fill up the HEPAs pretty darn quickly.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so you probably need like a pre-filter.
But a lot of times the pre-filters are electrostatic.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you've looked into this, Bob? Or
not for, well, my previous life.
okay, got it. Okay. Yes, so you're right. Yes, you probably want to start a pre-filter, and then you could use a HEPA filter.
If there's that big smoke load, and I think that's maybe where Julie, is that kind of where you were taking us?
It just seemed like this is not a very good year for fire so far, but it feels like if you're in the middle of the grape harvest or something and there's fires, that rather than dealing with not only the issues in the vineyard, but you can actually contaminate your wines by not filtering the air. So it's kind of a precautionary tale. If you're in a bad fire environment, it might be worth looking into.
Yes, absolutely. And I believe there's some filters out there that will take out the smoke pretty effectively. Maybe you know more about that, Bob, than I do, but
not for this environment. I mean, this was in a little heavier industrial setting.
Yeah. Okay. So the winery water system, again, I would recommend you make sure your water is clean before you use it in your production area. If filtration is used for your water supply, you want to establish a program to routinely check the filter integrity, just like your wine filters. So you want to check the integrity of those filters. Usually they're membrane filters, so it's a similar type of process. If you should have activated carbon filter in place to prevent presence of chlorine in production water. So if you're using well water and you add chlorine to that, or if you're using city water and there's been chlorine been added, you need to have an activated carbon filter in place to get rid of the chlorine before it goes into your facility. Water hoses can be a source of contamination. So when I do the audits at wineries, I always check the water from the facility. And I find a lot of contamination in the water from hoses. So I always collect water from the hose, not the actual water drop. And so you want to periodically inspect the interior of the water hoses for cracks and replace them if they show cracks. And I would recommend periodic cleaning and sanitizing the interior of the water hoses, like once a year, where you actually can connect them together and form a big loop and just run a cleaner and a sanitizer through them. Because water hoses can develop a lot of contamination, especially if they're sitting on the ground. Okay, so those are the recommendations. Anybody else have any questions about the recommendations? Okay. So this last section, I'm going to talk about the impact of improved sanitation practices on reducing microbial loads. And these are actual examples from wineries. So this is just a general slide showing you the average microbial load for an initial sanitations versus follow-up sanitation audits. And so the y-axis shows you the average microbial load, which includes yeast, bacteria, and mold. The blue bar indicates the initial assessments. So I've gone in and done a sanitation audit. And then the red bar is the actual follow-up assessments. And so after I've done the baseline assessment, initial assessment, they improve their sanitation practices, and then I go back and do an audit. And the red bars show you what the loads are after they've improved their sanitation practices. So this is for crush equipment, cellar equipment, oak cooperage, bottling equipment, infrastructure, atmosphere, and water. So all the areas that I look at when I do an audit. And you can see the blue bars are quite a bit higher. And then once I do the second audit, the follow-up audit, the red bars are quite a bit lower than the blue bars. And so the microbial loads have dramatically decreased after they've improved their sanitation practices. This is for cellar equipment. Again, we have the average microbial load for the initial assessments, the blue bars, and then the red bars are for the follow-up assessments. So you can see for tank valves, tank walls and floors, small fittings, wine lines and hoses, pumps, oak cooperage, there's a significant drop in the microbial loads on this equipment during the follow-up sanitation audit, and because they've improved their sanitation practices. This is for bottling equipment. Again, these are all the areas that I check on a bottling system. Again, same thing. As long as they improve their sanitation practices, you can see a dramatic drop in the microbial loads. This actually slide shows you the actual microorganisms, wine spoilage microbes, and then what they look like during initial assessments, the average level during initial assessments versus follow-up assessments. And again, for all of the major wine spoilage microbes, there's a dramatic drop in these during the follow-up assessments. So this is actually one particular winery where they improve their sanitation practices, and you can see the difference in microbial loads after they've improved the practices. And this is for cellar equipment. So before the sanitation practices, before the baseline audit, they were using a caustic cleaner, a water rinse, and then citric acid rinse. So they were not using a sanitizer. And then the sanitation practices after the baseline audit, they were using a caustic cleaner or sodium bicarbonate for their cleaner. They were doing a water rinse, and then they implemented peracetic acid instead of using citric acid. And so the graph on the bottom shows the average microbial load for yeast, acetic acid bacteria, lactic acid bacteria, and mold. And this is for tank walls and floors, tank pumps and valves, the tank valves, pumps and hoses, and small parts, fittings. So you can see for yeast, for instance, on the baseline audit, they had very high levels of yeast on all of their equipment. And then at the follow-up audit, those levels went dramatically down. And this is true for the acetic acid bacteria, the lactic acid bacteria, and even for mold on some pieces of equipment. So it's all about, if they implement a good cleaning and sanitizing regime, you really can reduce the microbial loads on the equipment. This is a different winery, again, showing the impact of improved sanitation practice for cellar equipment. This winery, before the baseline audit, they used a caustic cleaner, sodium hydroxide, a water rinse, chlorine dioxide, so a good sanitizer, but the chlorine dioxide was used for short times. They were doing little to no scrubbing with in the presence of the cleaner, and they were using incorrect concentration of the chlorine dioxide, so much lower than they were supposed to. And then after the baseline audit, they started implementing a caustic cleaner or sodium carbonate as their cleaner, a water rinse, and then they were using peracetic acid or chlorine dioxide. So they were kind of switching back and forth. And again, you see a very similar phenomenon where the average microbial load for yeast, acetic acid bacteria, lactic acid bacteria, and mold is quite high during the baseline audit. But then once they implemented this new practice, all of these microbes went down dramatically after they implemented these practices on all this equipment. Here's a third example for cellar equipment. Before the baseline audit, this winery was using sodium percarbonate as their cleaner. They were doing a water rinse, citric acid SO2, so acidulated SO2, water, and then ozone. But again, they were using short times for their cleaners and sanitizers. There was little to no scrubbing of the equipment. And again, they were using incorrect concentration. And then after the baseline audit, they implemented using sodium percarbonate. Sometimes they were using potassium hydroxide as a cleaner. They're using a water rinse and then peracetic acid. Again, the average microbial load for the yeast, acetic acid bacteria, lactic acid bacteria, pretty high for the baseline audit. And then once they implemented the improved sanitation practices, they see a dramatic drop in the microbial load for all of the equipment. So that was 3 examples of cellar equipment. What about bottling equipment? So this winery, before the baseline audit, they were using 10 minutes of steam. Again, you want to be at least 20 minutes. And then they were doing a water cool down at startup. And then at shutdown, they were doing a water rinse and then a hot water rinse for 20 minutes. So no chemical CIP, just hot water or steam for both startup and shutdown. And then after the baseline audit, they used 20 minutes of steam and then the water cool down at startup. And then at shutdown, they use warm potassium hydroxide or proxycarb, water rinse, and peracetic acid. And so the average microbial load for the yeast and even the acetic acid bacteria and the lactic acid bacteria all went down dramatically after they implemented the new sanitation practices at startup and shutdown. And then another example for bottling equipment. This winery was using, before the audit, they were using 30 minutes of steam and then a water cool down. And then they were doing at shutdown a water rinse and then hot water rinse. So they weren't doing hot water for very long at shutdown. Again, no chemical CIP. And then after the baseline audit at startup, they were using 30 minutes of steam again. And then at shutdown, they started using hot water or potassium hydroxide or proxycarb as their cleaner. And then they did a water rinse and used peracetic acid as their sanitizer. And again, all of the microbes were quite high before the audit, before the baseline audit, or at the baseline audit. And then after they implemented the improved sanitation practices, they basically have no microbes on their equipment except for a little bit of mold. And then here's a third example for the bottling equipment. The sanitation practices before the audit, they were using hot water for 20 minutes at 190 degrees, which is good. And then at shutdown, they were using a warm potassium hydroxide water rinse, citric acid, and then water. So no sanitizer at shutdown. And then after the baseline audit, they continued with hot water for 20 minutes at startup. And then at shutdown, they were strictly using warm potassium hydroxide, a water rinse, and a peracetic acid. And again, they had a dramatic decrease in the microbial load after the implemented the effective sanitation practices. And there's one example here for infrastructure, and this specifically for floors. At this particular winery, before the baseline audit, they were used pressure washing annually and occasionally cleaning with sodium bicarbonate. So they weren't doing cleaning very frequently, and they weren't using any sort of sanitizer. And then after the baseline audit, quarterly, they started using caustic foam or sodium bicarbonate to clean. They were doing a water rinse, and then they were applying quaternary ammonium compound, the sanitizer that I was talking about earlier. And you can see on the floors, the average microbial load was quite high for the yeast, acetic acid bacteria, and lactic acid bacteria before at the baseline audit. And then when they implemented the improved sanitation practices, the microbial loads dramatically decreased in all categories. And that's it. Anybody have any questions?
So if you want to ask a question now, you're welcome to. If you feel more comfortable, you're welcome to send an email to me and ask questions later. It's totally up to you.
Hey, Bob, I got a kind of a dumb one. Can you run those little foam balls, those pigs, through a positive displacement pump? I mean, it's certainly not through a centrifugal, but can you run them through positive displacement pumps?
I heard that you can, but you need to check with the manufacturer first. I know some wineries that do it, but they check with the manufacturer just to make sure that they can.
Thank you.
You can't do it with a centrifugal, you're right.
Sure.
Yeah.
Could you explain about the audit process, the walkthrough? What do you do actually from, let's say, working with a winery from the start to at the post results or baseline results? So what can you walk through that?
Sure, yeah. So I'll go to a winery and I will collect air samples, so atmosphere samples, using large Petri plates. So it's called passive accumulation. And I'll put those in various areas in the production areas. And then I collect water samples from their various production areas. And then I collect infrastructure swab samples. So I'll collect samples from floors, drains, walls in their production areas. And I'll kind of pick, a few different locations in each production area to collect those swabs. But I always get at least one floor sample and at least one drain sample. If it's a larger air production area, I will actually collect more samples in that area from the drains and the floor. And then I collect swab samples from equipment. So all the way from harvest equipment, swab those equipment. I'll collect from cellar equipment, tanks, hoses, hard lines, fittings, pumps, miscellaneous equipment. And I'll also collect samples if they have a bottling line they want me to do, I'll collect samples from that. Usually when I do a bottling line, I'll have them disconnect as much piping as they can, especially around the wine filtration system and from the filtration system up to the filler, so that I can swab inside of that piping. And then once I collect all the samples, they're collected in saline tubes. So I'll swab and then put the swab in a saline tube. And then I take those samples back to my lab and I plate all those onto microbiological media. and then allow them to grow up in the incubator. And then I will read all the plates. And as I said before, that's probably the most time-consuming process of these audits, because I'm trying to sift through, what yeast and bacteria or molds are there. And if there's a lot there, it's time-consuming. And then once I determine how many microbe, yeast, bacteria, molds are there, I also try to identify what types of yeast are there, what types of bacteria are there, what types of molds are there, as much as possible from the plates. Once I've collected what types of microbes are there and how many are there, I then record that, and I will then send a report out, which will document all of my findings. And also I will provide recommendations for improvement. And if necessary, I'll also provide sanitation best practices. So I'll have recommendations for improvement, and then I'll actually lay out the sanitation best practices for the facility. And so the report will have all of that in it. And the report usually ends up being, 15 to 30 pages long, depending on how big the facility is.
So Bob, if you were doing a grade of A to F, can you kind of break down a little bit about how you determined how many microbes would it take to be an A versus a B versus a C?
I do have that all broken down. And in fact, what I do, which I didn't mention, is I give a score for the audit. So, and I score it from 0 to 100. And the issue is I have different specifications for infrastructure versus cellar equipment versus harvest equipment versus bottling equipment. So to answer your question is a little difficult because I have to go get my sheet and tell you exactly what they are. But
it's fine. If people are interested, I can share that with them.
Yeah. But I will give a score because I'll actually, depending on how many microbes are present, I actually have a Excel calculator that I calculate a score based on the actual microbes present there. And so usually when I do an audit the first time, most wineries will be in this, between 65 and 80 for a score, which is not great to okay, right? So it's kind of like if you're in the 90 or above, it's excellent. 80 or above, it's good. 70 or above, it's fair. 60 or above, it's not good, not good at all. And if you're below 60, there's a failure in your sanitation system. But that helps people gauge how effective their sanitation program is. And a lot of after they do improve their sanitation practices, a lot of wineries will be in the 80s and the 90s. Any other questions?
Yeah, another question is how long is the report from the time you actually do the audit to the reports? How long does it take?
Usually 10 days to 14 days.
Okay, that's not too long. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, because I always like to try to let the plates incubate for 7 days because some of the wine bacteria take longer to grow up. So I always let them, if I can, let them incubate for 7 days.
Well, that sounds like that was all of our questions for today. So thank you very much, Bob.
You're
for
welcome.
Your 3-part series. And anyone that has questions for Bob, you're welcome to contact me. And you probably noticed in your email invitation that you have Bob Tracy's email address now. But if you have any more comments or questions, I'm sure he's happy to answer those for you.
Yes.
I have already sent out emails with some of the lab reports to a few people that asked me after the last session. And if your winery would like the analysis that I have from doing the uncorked events and the savor events, I'm happy to share the data with you. So just let me know. And we do have a new set of data that Bob just finished. So there is some more data to be shared. So you're welcome to ask me if you need to. But it sounds like we're done. So thank you very much, Bob. I really appreciate your time.
You're welcome.
And thanks everybody else for showing up as well. So we'll see you all soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.